Throughout the history of the United States, law and legislation has played a critical role in both creating racial inequalities and advancing racial justice, with legislation in particular creating racial inequities.
Most of the history, the legal racial history of the United States, is a story of really pulling back of rights from African American people. So for about 350 years, the United States really was run under a system of white supremacy, racial hierarchy that really designated Black people as property. This was a ugly, brutal period of time where Black people were subjected to enslavement, yes, definitely, but also to torture, degradation, and rape as well. And we moved from that period of time to emancipation of the enslaved people. But it wasn't a straight route at all.
These ideals of a nation that were written into our Constitution, but at the time of our Constitution and our nation's founding were, not extended to everyone, not extended to women, not extended to people of color, not extended to anyone except for landholding white men.
You have 350 years of racial retrenchment, right? And a few years of racial progress, 14 years under the Reconstruction era. And then we have the Civil Rights Movement. We have, the Civil Rights Act. We have the Fair Housing Act. We have the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And we have the Voting Rights Act. Now, in 2020, since 2020, we've seen a decline again in terms of a lot of state legislatures really coming forward and enacting legislation that's going to make it more difficult for people to vote, particularly people who live in Black communities.
The Sphere Consortium consists of the higher education institutions in St. Petersburg. So there are 4 institutions, including Stetson. There's also St. Petersburg College, Eckerd College, and USF. So we have 2 fellows from each of those institutions joining together to really create this consortium of higher education institutions that are focused on racial equity in St. Petersburg and in Pinellas County. As a racial justice fellow, our goal is to create a culture of racial equity across campuses and across our community. So it's bringing that racial equity lens to our campus as well as to our city and our county.
What have you learned so far from being in the Racial Justice Fellows program?
Well, so we've learned about looking at the racial history and then how to change policies in the future, looking at things such as economics, the law for us, separation, programs that are going on, and then how to apply what we learned to actually create an effective and sustainable change in the future.
The deans of the 11 law schools of Florida formed the Florida Law School Consortium for Racial Justice in response to those events in 2020, but also in response to long-standing racism. Lawyers have the responsibility not only to fight for justice, but also to improve the law and to understand how the law has formed this racial hierarchy in this country.
And so both of these groups are educating students to really stand up, speak out against injustices, to be able to talk about these inequities in a way that I think will bring more people to the table so that we can make more racial progress, because we got to the position that we're in terms of the racial hierarchy that exists in this country and the racial inequities. We got to this point as a result of laws, as a result of legalized discrimination, legalized slavery, legalized voting restrictions, right? And so we have to reverse that through the law as well.
Legislative advocacy is really about looking at what's supposed to be a rule that's applied equally for everyone. And when we see outliers that have disproportionate effects, whether it's people of color or what have you, then we have to call those things out and analyze and look at why those laws are being passed and what can be done to change that.
We constantly see legislation in many areas restricting rights and further entrenching racial injustice, but at the same time, we see people pushing their legislators to do the right thing and to increase the amount of racial equity that we're experiencing in this country. So there's definitely a lot of hope there.
I think anything worth having it's usually accompanied by some challenges. And it's not achieved overnight, but it's achieved.
One of the main things that we do is we look at which legislators are supporting bills that would further racial justice and which legislators are supporting bills that would negatively impact it.
Part of our job, I think, has to be to translate the legal language that may be part of the legislation and to make it really simple so that people understand, oh, this is relevant to my life. In the wake of George Floyd's death and all of the protests that took place globally, we began to see U.S. legislators at the state level introducing legislation to prevent people from engaging in protests. In the state of Florida, we had, I think, one of the most notorious anti-protest laws. It made headlines all across the country.
Yes, so advocacy groups like the Dream Defenders and the NAACP and the Black Lives Matter groups came together and actually petitioned to the court to rule the anti-protest bill in Florida unconstitutional. And the federal court actually found that the bill was, in fact, discriminatory against Black protesters.
Critical race theory is a theory that examines how race and racism in America has formed social and political structures and legal structures that pertain to everybody's life. 42 states have passed or have proposed critical race theory, anti-critical race theory legislation. Of those 42 states, 15 of them have passed the bills, and 11 of them have stalled indefinitely or defeated the anti-CRT legislation bills. Race is always going to be an integral part of American history. CRT very rarely is implemented in K through 12 education. It's really something that comes into play in like law school and some other graduate education programs. America was founded on racism, and it has continued racist traditions throughout history. So that's something we're still dealing with today.
So if we shut down racial discussions about race and racial history, what happens in our democracy?
Honestly, we just remain stagnant. Like right now, we're not at a place where we've had the racial healing that we need to have.
So in 2021, you had 19 states that passed 34 laws that made it more difficult for people to vote.
And it's important for us to fight against apathy, right? To make sure that people stay engaged, right? Because that's the only hope we really have for achieving racial equity. When people lose hope, they don't vote, they stay home, they stop engaging in the public dialogue around racial justice, and we won't ever achieve that ideal.
So they said, well, if I can't even exercise my vote without jumping through hoops and over hurdles, why try?
Truth is really the foundational aspect of this, is getting that story out and saying, you know, what we maybe have been told in the past about what our nation was founded on is sometimes not true. Transformation is really the only way forward. So we have to look for a vision of how we can move forward in a new way. That's a really important aspect of it that gets lost sometimes when you think about racial justice work, is that people think that it's just anger and sadness and pain, and there is that involved, but there's so much promise. That transformation aspect is a visioning that we can do together to create something better than we've ever had.